So we racked our brains at the museum. Who can we find to give us a talk on automotive history and cars? It's something that at the museum, neither Lisa Codd nor I have a lot of expertise in. So we were really happy when we were referred to Nigel Matthews, and he agreed to do this talk for us. Nigel has a long career history of working with cars as a technician, right? And then later for ICBC, managing the collector plates program.
Collector and vintage program.
That's right. And he is, you're currently working for Haggerty's, right?
Yep.
Which is an insurance company that...
Haggerty is the world's largest classic car and boat insurer.
Right, yes.
Yep.
Nigel's also been invited to judge at international car shows, and he also has a special interest in Model Ts, some of which we have here at our museum. So we thought, perfect, this is the right guy to give a little talk. I don't know how you want to structure it, if it's more of a talk and then questions after, or just sort of informal as we go. But I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, because sometimes people have a question and then they forget. So by all means, just jump in if you have a question.
Yeah.
Jump in, please do, and ask.
Yes, and so we'll start here at the Royal Oak Garage, and then we thought we'd move down to the Carousel Garage to take a look at the collection that we have there of cars. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming out. I hope I won't bore you to death. I am absolutely obsessed with cars and have oil running through my veins. So I think what I'll do is I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of automotive history and how it all kind of took place in Vancouver. Before the automobile came along, it was horse and buggies and that type of thing, and it's quite appropriate that we have the blacksmith shop here, because the blacksmiths would make the springs for the buggies and take care of the wheels on the wagons and make the horseshoes. That kind of evolved, and the next step was bicycles. So a lot of blacksmiths became bicycle manufacturers, and after bicycles it became motorcycles, and then motorcycles progressed into the automobile. So the oldest, or the first car to appear in Vancouver, was a Stanley steamer in circa 1899. And actually steam cars and electric cars were far more popular until Henry Ford came out with a Model T Ford, and that's when the gasoline engine took off. The first gasoline-powered car in Vancouver arrived in 1904. And it wasn't long after that they needed gas stations, because they basically used to get a hold of gas. There were three types of gas. Some was used in cleaning stains off women's clothing, and some was used in lamps and things like that. So there was a need for gas stations, because the cars were quite crudely filled by they used to go down to the depot and dip these buckets in and pour the gasoline into the vehicles. So believe it or not, the first gas station in Vancouver was actually the first gas station in Canada, and that was in 1907. And there's a plaque on a building at Cambie and Smythe. That's where it was located, and there was a plaque erected there in, I think, around 1957. The gas station was opened by Imperial Oil, which is Esso, and at that time gasoline cost 20 cents a gallon. When we go inside, I'll talk a little bit about the sleeve valve engine that's in there. There's a very fine example of a CCM motorcycle. Canada Cycle Motor Company is where the CCM comes from, but some of you will be more familiar with those initials growing up wearing CCM hockey equipment, or perhaps having a CCM bicycle.
Yeah. Do you know where the first gasoline came from? Not out of the ground, but was it from the States, or was it?
I don't know, to tell you the truth. I really don't. I suspect it probably came from the US somewhere. Yeah. Probably. I mean, the crude. Well, probably Alberta and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania crude and Alberta, I suspect. It's probably where they all came from to refine it. Yeah. So bicycles and motorcycles. Well, so if you look at the CCM, have a closer look when we go in. It really is not much more than a glorified bicycle with an engine in the frame. CCM evolved into building cars, like a lot of other companies, and the car that they manufactured was the Russell, which they made in Canada. There is actually quite a famous one in Vancouver that has been driven right across the country and belongs to one of the Vintage Car Club members. This is the vehicle that changed the world. Henry Ford. Henry Ford built his first Model T in 1908, and he kind of pioneered mass production and the production line. It used to take 12 hours to make a Model T Ford, and consequently the cost in those days, in 1908, was $825, which is quite a bit of money. As he perfected the production line, and they managed to get the techniques and the production line time to drop, they managed to get that to drop down to 2 hours. And Henry Ford passed on those savings to the consumer by lowering the price, and it's not very often a car manufacturer lowers his price, from $825 to $260. So that's pretty miraculous. It had a 3-speed transmission, basically 2 forward gears and 1 reverse gear. It has a very complicated setup of arrangement of pedals. There are 3 pedals on the floor. One pedal operates the forward gears, first the slow speed and fast speed. The other pedal operates the reverse gear. There's a lever that you pull for braking. So without question, you would be far too busy driving a Model T Ford today to be able to use your cell phone at the same time. The engine was pretty sizable. It was a 4-cylinder engine, but it was 2.9 litres or 177 cubic inches. So the pistons in there are probably quite about the size of a flower pot. It's never been substantiated that Henry Ford said you can have a Model T in any color you want as long as it's black. That was just a good story. In fact, up until 1914, you could only get them in red, green, blue, or gray. It wasn't until after 1914 and up until 1926 that you could get them in black. The oldest Model T in British Columbia is a 1909 model. So that would make it in the first batch of the first 10,000 ever built. So quite a significant vehicle. The first Canadian-built Model T Ford was built in Walkerville, Ontario. Walkerville was a large, very large town that had its own fire department, and lots of manufacturers had factories there. And the Walker, from the Walkerville name, comes from Hiram Walker, the distillery. He came from the US and set up in Ontario and basically built his own town. That town now is called Windsor, another great car manufacturing town. The Model T Ford had a nickname, and it was known as the Tin Lizzie. And a lot of people wonder where that name came from. A lot of people think probably it's derived from the mechanical horse, the tin coming from the metal that it was made from, and Lizzie or Liz was a common name back in those days given to a horse. So that's where supposedly the Tin Lizzie nickname comes from. The Model T Ford was, without question, the car of the 19th century. By the time production ceased, 15,458,000 examples had been built. It would take a further 45 years before another car would surpass that figure. Can anybody hazard a guess at what that particular car might have been?
Toyota Corolla?
Mustang?
Volkswagen.
The Volkswagen Beetle. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the cars of the century were the Model T Ford, the Volkswagen Beetle, and the Mini. So what we have in front of us here is it probably began life as a depot hack. It's now a light commercial vehicle and was probably used for delivering groceries and vegetables and that type of thing. But when it was a depot hack, it probably had 2 rows of seats inside, and they were used to pick up passengers from the railway station and their luggage and take them to hotels.
I've always wondered about that nomenclature, the depot hack.
Yeah.
Because there's also, you know, the station wagon,
Yes.
right? That's analogous, isn't it? the
Yeah.
same concept.
Yeah, yeah. That's the depot hack grew into the station, or became the station wagon. You're right. Yeah, and the hack comes from, I believe, the Hackney carriage,
Yeah.
the taxi. So so the taxi cab.
So the depot was the earlier term for the train depot,
station.
and then it became the station.
Yeah, yeah. So consequently, the depot hack. Yeah, the train station taxi.
The Model Ts, though, they were the commoner's car. I mean, they were never a status car, were they?
No, Henry Ford was a clever, very clever chap. His biggest customers were his employees, because his employees were probably the best paid in the country. They earned, I think, close to $5 a day. So he was very clever. Most of his employees were his customers. And they were pretty incredible cars, and they were used for everything. Some people put tracks on them. The roads weren't exactly roads in those days. They were terrible, terrible. And these things could sustain and manage just about anything.
I heard that his initial target was rural customers.
Yeah,
Like he was very interested in the rural customers, and that was his original concept.
he was, because he was very fond of farmers and came from that background himself. Yeah.
So he wasn't really envisioning at first the fleets of Model Ts in the cities.
No.
That came later.
He wanted to build an inexpensive car that people could afford to buy and maintain themselves, because they weren't terribly complicated. They came with a selection of tools, and to this day they're still very simple to work on. Interestingly enough, his wife didn't drive one. She drove a Detroit Electric. She didn't want to have to get out and hand start a vehicle by swinging a handle, and nor did many doctors. If they needed to go and see a patient in a hurry, they wanted to get in and go. So the Detroit Electric vehicles, which were commonplace up until about 1920, a bit quicker than a steam car. It takes quite a while for a steam car to get up to temperature and to be able to go. Other than a steam car called a Doble, which very few are made, and they were ready to go within a minute and a half. Jay Leno has one of the 4 that are still remaining in the world in his collection.
Just a bit of trivia. I think an electric car set the land speed record in 1896, I think, and a steam car set it in 1906.
Yes, that's
So
about
they
right.
they were faster in the original development of the car till the internal combustion engine really got going.
Yeah, particularly steam cars. Steam cars were capable, some of them doing considerable speed. And the thing with electric and steam vehicles, it's torque, and you get it all instantly. Not like a combustion engine where you have to wait for the torque to build up.
Wasn't there a story that Jay Leno got his speed ticked on the way to work driving the steam car?
It's quite possible. Yeah, I've spent some time with him. I've been down and played cars with him a couple of times, and he does drive the Stanley Steamer home. Well, he's got about 7 of them, but he was driving one home one evening, and he saw this elderly couple, and he pulled over and asked if they would like a ride. And so they hopped in, and he's giving them a ride, and they were telling him that there's a train around here. He said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, there's a train around here, and it blows its whistle, but we've never been able to see it." And he just kind of smiled, and he reached down and he pulled the lever. And he went, "You mean like this whistle?"
So I've heard too that Standard Oil played a decisive role in shifting away from steam and electric and moving into gas, because they had all this waste byproduct called gasoline, and when they realized they could sell it to car owners, they really got behind developing the internal combustion engine.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And
and then batteries, of course, sort of lagged and became less.
yeah, Edison, Thomas Edison, who was Henry Ford's great friend. I mean, most of the electric cars in those days were using Edison batteries. We probably, I think Toyota are the ones that have got it figured out the best to date, with electric vehicles and hybrids. I'm sure that we could probably use electricity or even go back to steam. Problem is that there's an abundance of fuel, and it's just so readily available. When you think about the diesel vehicles that they use in Europe, Diesel, I mean, they're incredible cars, but they have never caught on in North America because we just have too much petrol, and it's still inexpensive. But in England, you're paying over $10 a gallon. So people have
One of the
opted.
problems they've got with electric cars today is that
The battery is the unknown of the battery, isn't it?
well, there's that, and it's the batteries that have a high energy density are very unstable. If you punch a hole in a big lithium battery, it's like blowing up the block.
Yes,
You know?
yeah, and I'm sure, and I know that a lot of fire departments are very leery about going to accidents involving electric vehicles. And the other big unknown is the life of the battery. It's the big unknown. It's been projected that they will last maybe 8 years. They've lasted longer, but when the time comes that they have to be replaced, you're talking thousands of dollars. And try selling a used electric car around about the time that the battery needs to be replaced.
I've heard that promise with light bulbs too.
Oh yes, and they're not very eco-friendly to build. To build these batteries, it's not very green at all.
At State Falls, they have a 1922 electric car, I think it is.
It's a 10, yeah.
You seen that?
Yeah.
And all the original batteries are out. They just got a series of, you open up the trunk, and it looks like an old Model T kind of car, and it's all modern batteries shoved in the trunk. That's how they're running it.
Yeah. Jay Leno has a 1906 Baker electric, and he still has the Edison batteries in it.
Really?
And it really doesn't look anything much more than a horse carriage, minus the two rails up front where the horse would be attached. And he takes great pleasure in going out for dinner in it with his wife Mavis. It doesn't have a steering wheel, it just has a tiller bar. Okay. And he loves showing up at restaurants and jumping out and watching the valet parker. And he tells them to get out and he parks it himself. We'll have a quick look at what we have over here. Over here we have a sleeve valve engine. They were a very deluxe engine used in Daimlers and Minervas and very, very high-end cars. You'll notice that it doesn't have intake and exhaust valves like a common car today does. The early cars had side valves and flat cylinder heads, and then later on the valves were placed into the cylinder head. But if you watch this, so we've got induction. So on this stroke, gasoline's coming into the bore here. Now we've got compression, so the gasoline is being compressed by the piston. When it gets to the top, there's a spark from the spark plug. We get an explosion. The piston gets pushed down by that explosion. And then these ports open up here to let the exhaust out, which normally would be done by valves in a cylinder head. So it's quite clever the way these little openings open and close as these sleeves go up and down. And these engines were so quiet you could hardly hear them coming. But the problem was that they did consume a lot of oil. There was a water jacket in here that kept them cool. It's just kind of nice to have this cutaway. And so if you have visitors coming in, you can sort of, and it's got the cycles here. But you can kind of explain to them a little bit about how the sleeve valve engine works with these sleeves basically going up and down.
So did the sleeve valve engines go out of fashion after
They did,
time?
yeah, they did. They were quite expensive to build, and when the valve, the side valve and the overhead valve engine came along, they were much easier to build and to maintain. Some of the other equipment in the shop here, and as I said, garages just evolved, and there was a need for them because people had to get their vehicles fixed. So basically the blacksmith shop later on became the garage, the local garage. The CCM is actually quite a stunning piece of equipment, and very, very few of these have survived, so it's quite a valuable bike. We've got some license plates, early license plates up here. And there's the Russell Motor Car Company, which, you know, the CCM became Russell. You look at the prices, $2,500, that's a lot of money. It's an awful lot of money. Early license plates, the earliest license plate in BC was actually, they were leather, embossed leather. I believe it's 1918. I think the 1918 BC license plate is one of the hardest ones to come across. So if you find one, grab it, it's worth a fortune. The bicycle played a big part in transportation.
Especially for women.
Yeah, and on here, you know, this is a lady's bicycle with lots of room to get in and out with that nice big dress on. And this elaborate guard to keep your thing away from the chain. And we've got the delivery bicycle here. The butcher and the grocer, and a lot of companies use these. I think even some pharmacists up until the sort of 50s were still making deliveries on these. This is a riveting tool that would be used for riveting brakes and things like that. We've got a lathe here to do the armature on the generator. Just an array of things, some tools. They weren't very nice to hold, they were heavy, quite crude, but they did the job. That's all they had. And over here we've got a coil tester. This is a device for checking that the coil in the car is working. That works. It works, yeah. You can see the current. You don't want to put your hands across the terminals there, you'll get a shock of your life. And there's a early engine, the Model T engine, and here's the Model T gearbox with the 3 levers, 3 pedals. I've driven one and they're not terribly easy to drive. They take quite a bit of getting used to.
So tire technology, I gather, was a whole issue with it, so getting heads on. And
a lot of early cars, some of the early cars used solid rubber tires. They tried to make it easy by having kind of split rims where the rim was detached from the spokes. So it made it a little bit easier to, a bit like a truck tire, you know, where you've got the 2 halves coming on either side of the tire, 2 halves of the wheel, of the rim. And we'll probably get a better example of that when we go down underneath the carousel. There's a vehicle in there we can have a look at.
When did the inflatable tires come out?
They were around quite early on. I mean, there's definitely by the time the Model T Ford came about, so really early in the beginning of the century. Yeah. Although I drove a car once, a Moscovich, made in Russia. It was in the 60s, and it was using solid rubber tires.
Was they're durable.
Quite the ride. So, does anybody have any questions about this kind of equipment that's in here?
Yeah, I've got one question about the. Can we just go back a bit to the car outside?
Yeah.
You said there are 3 pedals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you list for me the 3 pedals, please? Starting
I'll
from,
try.
say, the far left.
Yeah, one of them is for reverse gear.
Yes.
One of them kind of acts a bit like the clutch and gets you going. And then the third pedal, when you depress that, you go from sort of low speed to high speed. And the braking is done by a lever. I can, if it's helpful, I can send Sonia something and she can print it out. Right, I did a whole story.
You have to down in the other garage.
Yeah.
Where you can see it.
Yeah.
So that's a question too about licensing. When did BC start figuring they needed to issue licenses and control?
I think quite early on, right about 1910, 1911. So very.
And how about insurance on cars? When did that come in?
No, that didn't come along till quite a bit later on. And just a little bit of insurance trivia. Believe it or not, during the Second World War, there wasn't one single claim submitted to an insurance company for a car that burst into flames or was stolen.
You mean it didn't happen, or no one was submitting claims?
It's just nobody was submitting claims. Yeah. I mean, the business that we're in, with the number of classic cars that we insure in Canada, the US, and Europe, if everything we insured went up in smoke tonight, we'd have to find $19 billion. Yeah. The most expensive car we insure is $65 million. It's a Mercedes-Benz that Sterling Moss and Dennis Jenkinson drove in the Mille Amiga. It lives in the Mercedes-Benz Museum. The second most expensive car is a $55 million Bugatti, one of 4 built. 3 survived. One gentleman in France was out driving around with his mistress. She was driving and they got hit by a train coming over the railway tracks. But that car's $55 million and that belongs to Ralph Lauren. Yeah, there's some very substantial car collections out there. We just offered coverage on a private collection that just changed hands privately for $250 million. And the gentleman buying the collection thought that there was a particular car that he was going to get in this purchase. And when they were all delivered, that particular car wasn't in the collection. He phoned up the seller and said, "Where's the Bentley? I thought I was getting the Bentley." He says, "No, you want the Bentley, that's another 10 million.
So I'm curious about driver's licenses again. Could anyone just get a car and go driving around?
Yeah, I don't think driver's licenses came for quite some time. I mean, even the stories I've heard from my parents prior to the Second World War, they were just kind of, everybody was out there just driving. Well,
if
your fuel,
New Western
when you got
hills.
low, yes, if you got very low on fuel in the tank, if you didn't have that pressure to push the fuel down to the pump, yeah.
Then you had to reverse uphill, right?
Some did, didn't they?
Yeah,
I've heard that story.
Somebody told me, you could cut a tennis ball in half and put it under the pedal, and that would act as a pump.
I don't see how that would. No, I don't know. How
I'm thinking it would just invert itself again, like it would.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you answered this before, but where is the fuel tank here?
I can't see it on this one.
Someone was asking the other day.
Is it?
On the touring car, it's under the seat.
Okay, so it's still
under the seat on the touring car.
Okay.
So it's still high enough because the carburetor was mounted down very low. It was there in an updraft. The fuel pump that we have in front of us, there weren't any self-serve gas stations back in the early days, so there would have been a large tank underground. When you pulled into a filling station, you would tell the attendant how many gallons you wanted, and he would operate this red lever here and hand pump the fuel from the tank up into the bowl, which is marked with increments of gallons. And then when he had the 5 or the 6 gallons or whatever you wanted into the bowl, he would put the nozzle into the car and it would basically gravity feed into the fuel tank.
There are no, just in case you're wondering, there are no marks on our tank for some reason.
Right. Yeah. So at least you didn't have to worry about what you would have to worry about today, going into a filling station with a power cut. You'd be able to get gas today, but in those days that wouldn't have been a problem. The Nash Motor Company was founded by Charles W. Nash, who was formerly the president of General Motors. So he founded the Nash Motor Company in 1916. They were a beautiful vehicle, and this particular vehicle, if you look at it, it's very sporty, 1929. When the roof is up, it has a very low roof line, so it's a bit like being in a hot rod with this very small windshield. Has this got... They made an incredible engine. Later on, Nash merged with Kelvinator, the refrigerator manufacturer, and they did. In fact, yeah, a Nash Kelvinator was the first car to have air conditioning. Yeah.
I would have suckered.
Some of you have probably, or most of you would have seen a bubble car. You know, the little bubble car where the door opens from the front.
Oh yeah.
Every car collection has one in it. I can guarantee that. That car was built by a company called Isetta, and Isetta were an Italian refrigerator manufacturer. So that's the principle of that door, you know, opens like a refrigerator door. Problem with the early bubble cars like that, the very early ones, didn't have any reverse gears. And a lot of people would come into a parking lot and they would see a parking space and zip into a parking space, and then right in front of them would be a brick wall. And they couldn't get out of the car because the door opens forwards and they've got no reverse gear. So you'd see them sitting in there rocking the car. Nash's slogan from the 20s and the 30s was, give the customer more than he has paid for. That's a pretty good slogan for a manufacturer, I think. I believe this car has is the history of the car on the front there? Yeah. It's got a local history to it. It would be somewhat of a challenge, I would think, with a lady in a very long dress to clamber up these 2 steps and maneuver her way into the dicky seat in the back. Probably better suited for the children. The Nash company then merged after the Carbonator. They acquired the Thomas B. Jeffrey company. He owned Rambler. And they continued on in business right up until 1954, and then Nash became AMC, or American Motors Corporation as we would know it, which stayed in business up until 1987 when it was acquired by Chrysler. So here we have a wonderful example of a late 20s vehicle. Something a little bit older over here too.
Just before you do that, you called that a dicky seat.
Called a dicky seat.
Why is it?
Dicky.
Do you know why?
Well, yeah, they did call them a rumble. Well, maybe I'm speaking in English terms.
No, that's right.
Yeah. In England, we call them dicky seats. Yeah.
Do you know why?
I don't. I should find out.
It's for Richard. It goes down.
Okay.
Okay, what we have here. 1911, Todd Hope Everett 30. Well, the 30 portion of it comes from the horsepower, 30 horsepower vehicle. Tug Hope began manufacturing cars around about 1909, and shortly thereafter the factory was completely leveled to the ground in a fire. The factory was in Orillia, Ontario. Most people would have just given up and moved on, but within 97 days the factory was rebuilt, and it was a sizable factory and built out of brick. In fact, it's still there today and makes up part of the Lakehead University campus. This particular vehicle has a local history. It was supplied brand new to Captain Coates, North Vancouver, Cates I mean. Cates, the Cates Park and the Cates Tugboat Company. Yeah, so it's been around for a long time. You'll notice that it's got acetylene headlights. The acetylene would have gone into this canister here. It's missing the tubes that would have taken the acetylene to the lamps up front. You would physically light them with a match, and they burn extremely bright. You know, you get this incredible white light. So consequently, they made great headlights for vehicles. They used them on the Model T Ford as well.
Would they be realized too?
You probably wouldn't want to touch the outside of the headlamp body itself, and they were all in those days made in brass, probably to try and dissipate the heat, being a non-ferrous metal.
Why is it right-hand drive?
Early cars, and you'll notice that British Columbia was one of the last. It was the last, to change, to convert over to left-hand drive.
Do you know what year it was that they converted over?
I don't.
23, 22, and everybody else went midnight the night before.
And in Sweden, they did it in the late 60s.
68, yeah.
Can you imagine, as of the stroke of midnight, we're... Gosh, it wouldn't work in Richmond.
Nigel, we have about 5 minutes.
Okay, so this car's not... Well, this car was quite an expensive car in its day, too. It would cost about $1,850. And I suspect it's extremely rare. There's probably very, very few of these in existence today. I believe this one's been modified slightly so that it would be quite difficult to change the rims, because you would normally have been able to detach the rim from the spokes.
And did it drive like a conventional car, or like Model T, did it have goofy pedals?
Yeah. This one's conventional. You know, the throttle's the little brass pedal on the floor. Your speeds are probably operated from the lever, the hand lever. One would be a hand brake. One would be to change the gears. You can see actually there's a bit of a gear gate on there. Yeah. Yeah, it was quite common to have that center throttle pedal.
And it's a foot pedal though.
Yeah. What we have behind us is a Canadian-built Model T Ford. The Canadian-built Model T Fords had a door on the driver's side. Some of the US models didn't. And the other difference between the Canadian and the US Model Ts was that the Canadian one used the same size of wheels and tires, front and rear. The US ones had larger wheels and tires on the back than the front. So that made it a little bit difficult for having a spare. You couldn't just have one spare wheel and tire. You had to have two. So, yeah, and I think if we can see inside this one, yeah, inside you can see this complicated pedal arrangement where the pedals go directly into the gearbox.
And is it true that the Model T was built with the steering wheel sort of easily moved from side to side, that there's sort of one pattern you can just change?
A lot of car manufacturers do that. Even if you have a 60s MG or a British car, you will look in at the bulkhead, you'll be able to see a blanking plate on one side. So the cars were made, the bodies were universally made so that they could be switched from left-hand drive to right-hand drive very easily. Another little trick that Henry Ford conjured up, he must have been a bit of a penny pincher. He dictated to his suppliers not only the type of wood that the shipping crates were made of, that the components were shipped to his factories in, but he also dictated the dimensions of the wood. And what he did, he disassembled those crates and he used those to make the floorboards in the cars. And then any other bits left over went out and became charcoal briquettes. You remember, well, of course, they're still made today. Kingsford briquettes?
Yes.
That's a Ford Motor Company.
Ford? Oh,
yeah.
Goodness.
So I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I wanted to thank Nigel. I think we all agree this has been fantastic, right? This is just the kind of information